The stone floor was cold beneath her knees, colder than it had ever been, and Lyra Ravenshade pressed her palms flat against the gray slate as if she could draw some warmth from the very rock that imprisoned her. The dungeons beneath the lunar keep smelled of mildew and old blood, scents that clung to the damp walls like ghosts refusing to leave. She had been dragged here in the dead of night, her wrists bound with iron shackles that bit into her skin with every shallow breath she took. The guards had not spoken to her, had not signed, had not even looked at her face as they threw her into this cell and locked the door behind them with a finality that echoed through her bones. She was 19 years old, and she had never spoken a word aloud in her life. Not since her mother died when she was 5. Not since the day the entire court had gathered around the funeral pyre and watched the Luna Queen's body turn to ash beneath the full moon. Lyra had opened her mouth that night, had felt the scream building in her throat like a living thing desperate to escape, but no sound had come. The silence had wrapped itself around her vocal cords and squeezed until she understood that words were useless in a world that had already decided she was broken. Her deafness had been obvious from birth, a cruel twist of fate for the only child of the most powerful Alpha King in the Northern Territories, and the court had whispered about it endlessly. Some said it was a curse from the Moon Goddess, punishment for her father's brutality in the wars that had unified the werewolf kingdoms under his iron rule. Others claimed her mother had been poisoned during pregnancy by enemies of the crown, that the deafness was merely a symptom of a deeper corruption in Lyra's blood. Whatever the truth, Lyra had learned quickly that silence was her only weapon. She had taught herself to read lips with an obsessive dedication that frightened her tutors, spending hours in front of mirrors mouthing words she could not hear, matching the shapes to the written language in the ancient texts that lined the royal library. She had refused to learn sign language despite her mother's gentle insistence, had turned her face away from every attempt to teach her, because signing would mean accepting that she was different, that she needed accommodation, that she was somehow less than the wolves who could hear the wind in the trees and the howls of the pack across the mountains. Her mother had understood, or at least Lyra believed she had. Queen Alara Ravenshade had been the only person in the entire kingdom who had looked at her daughter and seen something other than a disappointment, a political liability, a princess who could never rule because she could not hear the council of advisors or the cries of her people. Alara had sat with Lyra for hours in the palace gardens, writing notes back and forth in a leather journal that Lyra still kept hidden beneath her mattress, and in those quiet moments, Lyra had felt almost whole. But then her mother had died, suddenly and mysteriously, collapsing during a council meeting and bleeding from her mouth and nose before anyone could summon a healer. The official report had blamed a weak heart, a congenital defect that had finally caught up with her. But Lyra had seen the fear in her mother's eyes in those final moments, had watched her try to form words that would not come, and she knew in her soul that Alara had been murdered. No one had believed her, of course. How could they, when she could not speak, could not testify, could not even write a coherent accusation without being dismissed as a traumatized child inventing conspiracies to make sense of her grief? Her father, King Alistair Ravenshade, had locked himself in his chambers for 3 days after the funeral and emerged a different man, harder and colder than before, his gray eyes like chips of ice when he looked at Lyra across the dinner table. He had stopped trying to communicate with her entirely, leaving her education and care to a rotating cast of servants and tutors who treated her with a mixture of pity and contempt. The court had followed his lead, and within months, Lyra had become a ghost in her own home, drifting through the corridors of the Lunar Keep unseen and unheard. She had found solace only in her wolf, Celine, a gray she-wolf who had bonded with her during her first shift at 13, and who seemed to understand Lyra's silence as a choice rather than a deficiency. Together, they had explored the forests surrounding the keep during the rare moments when Lyra was allowed beyond the palace walls, running through the pine trees until her lungs burned and her mind emptied of everything except the pure joy of movement. But even those small freedoms had been stripped away after her 16th birthday, when her father had declared that she was too fragile to be allowed outside without a full guard escort, that the enemies of the crown might kidnap her and use her deafness against her. torture her for information she could not give. Lyra had known it was an excuse, a way to keep her contained and controllable, but she had no power to fight it. So she had retreated further into herself, spending her days in her chambers sketching the forests she could no longer visit, drawing wolves running beneath a moon she would never howl at. The servants whispered that she was mad, that the silence had driven her insane, and perhaps they were right. Perhaps madness was the only rational response to a life lived in a cage made of stone and obligation, and the suffocating weight of other people's expectations. And then the beta had come. Marcus Thornwood, her father's second-in-command and the most trusted advisor in the kingdom, had started visiting her chambers 3 months ago under the pretense of checking on her welfare. At first, Lyra had been grateful for the company, had even tried to engage with him by writing notes on the small chalkboard she kept by her bed. But his visits had grown more frequent and more invasive, his questions probing into her daily routine, her thoughts, her feelings about the court and her father's rule. He had touched her shoulder once, a lingering pressure that had made her skin crawl, and when she had pulled away, he had smiled in a way that made her want to shift and run. She had tried to tell her father, had written a careful letter describing Marcus's behavior and asking for the visits to stop, but Alistair had dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. Marcus is loyal, he had written back in his sharp, angular script, and you are lonely. Accept his friendship with grace. The message had been clear. Her discomfort meant nothing. Her instincts were not to be trusted, and she would endure whatever the beta chose to inflict upon her because she was powerless to refuse. The visits had continued, and Marcus had grown bolder. He had started bringing her gifts, expensive jewelry, and rare books that she had no interest in, and when she had tried to refuse them, he had insisted with a persistence that felt like violence. He had begun sitting closer to her, his thigh pressed against hers on the small sofa in her sitting room, his breath hot on her neck as he leaned over to read what she was writing. She had felt trapped, suffocated, violated in ways she could not articulate even to herself, and she had started locking her door and refusing to admit him when he knocked. That had been her first mistake. 2 weeks ago, Marcus had arrived at her door with 2 guards and a written order from the king demanding that she open the chamber immediately. She had complied because she had no choice, and Marcus had entered with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He had dismissed the guards and closed the door behind him, and Lyra had known with a certainty that made her hands shake that something terrible was about to happen. He had cornered her against the window, his body blocking any escape, and he had spoken to her in words she could read on his lips with perfect clarity. "You think you are too good for me," he had said, his hand coming up to grip her chin with bruising force. "You think your silence makes you special, makes you untouchable, but you are nothing, princess. Nothing but a defective omega that your father is desperate to marry off before you become a complete embarrassment to the crown." Lyra had tried to push him away, but he was stronger, his alpha dominance pressing down on her like a physical weight, and she had felt her wolf Celine howling inside her mind, desperate to shift and fight, but unable to override Lyra's human terror. Marcus had leaned in close, his lips nearly touching her ear as if she could hear him, and he had whispered something she could not read, something that made her stomach turn with disgust and fear. And then Celine had done something Lyra had not thought possible. Her wolf had surged forward without permission, had forced a partial shift that flooded Lyra's body with enough strength to shove Marcus backward, hard enough that he stumbled and fell against the sofa. The shock on his face had been almost worth the punishment that Lyra knew would follow, but she had not cared in that moment. She had run from the room, had fled down the corridor toward the one place in the palace where she had always felt safe, the Royal Archives. The archives were housed in the oldest wing of the Lunar Keep, a labyrinth of underground tunnels and vaulted chambers filled with thousands of years of pack history. Few people visited them anymore except for the archivists themselves, scholarly wolves who valued knowledge over politics and who had always treated Lyra with a quiet respect that she treasured. She had spent countless hours there as a child, reading ancient texts and teaching herself the forgotten languages of the wolf kingdoms that had existed before her father's conquest. The head archivist, an elderly woman named Vera, had allowed her to come and go as she pleased, and Lyra had thought of the archives as a sanctuary, a place where her silence was an asset rather than a flaw. She had been wrong about that too. When she had burst into the main reading room that day 2 weeks ago, gasping for breath and trembling with adrenaline, she had found it empty except for a single figure seated at one of the long wooden tables. He had looked up at the sound of her entrance, his dark eyes widening in surprise, and Lyra had frozen in the doorway like a deer scenting a predator. The man was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with black hair that fell across his forehead and the lean build of an Omega who had never trained for combat. He wore the simple gray robes of a palace scribe, and there was an ink stain on his left hand that suggested he had been writing for hours. But what had stopped Lyra's heart in her chest was not his appearance, but the way he had looked at her. Really looked at her, as if she were a person rather than a problem. And then he had done something that no one except her mother had ever done. He had lifted his hands and signed a single phrase in the formal sign language of the Wolf Kingdoms, the language Lyra had refused to learn but had absorbed anyway from years of watching her mother's desperate attempts to communicate with her. "I see you." 3 signs, simple and clear, and Lyra had felt something crack open inside her chest. A dam breaking after 14 years of holding back a flood. She had stared at him for a long moment, this stranger who had somehow known to speak to her in the one language she had sworn never to use. And then, without thinking, she had lifted her own hands and signed back. "Who are you?" His smile had been like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, warm and genuine and utterly unexpected. "My name is Evan Hartwood," he had signed, his movements precise and graceful. "I am the new assistant archivist, and you are Princess Lyra, though I suspect you prefer not to use your title here." Lyra had nodded, unable to do anything else, and Evan had gestured to the chair across from him in invitation. She had sat down slowly, her mind racing with questions she did not know how to ask, and he had returned to his work as if her presence were the most natural thing in the world. They had sat in silence for nearly an hour, Evan writing in a leather journal while Lyra tried to calm the frantic beating of her heart, and when she had finally stood to leave, he had signed a simple goodbye that had made her eyes burn with tears she refused to shed. She had returned the next day, and the day after that, drawn to the archives and to Evan's quiet acceptance like a moth to flame. They had not spoken at first, had simply existed in the same space while Evan worked, and Lyra pretended to read. But gradually they had begun to communicate in small ways. Evan would sign a question about the book she was holding, and Lyra would sign back a brief answer. He would show her an interesting passage from one of the ancient chronicles, and she would nod or shake her head in response. It had been careful and tentative, like 2 wild animals learning to trust each other, and Lyra had felt something unfurling in her chest that she had not experienced since her mother's death. Hope. But Marcus had found out. She did not know how, whether one of the servants had reported her visits to the archives, or whether the beta had simply been watching her more closely than she realized. But 3 days ago, he had appeared in the reading room while she and Evan were sitting together. Lyra had seen his face twisted with rage before Evan had even registered his presence, and she had tried to stand, to put herself between the beta and the Omega who had shown her nothing but kindness. But Marcus had been faster. He had grabbed Evan by the throat and slammed him against the wall with enough force to crack the stone, and Lyra had felt her wolf surge forward again, desperate to protect this man who had become important to her in ways she did not fully understand. But before she could shift, Marcus had turned on her, his eyes blazing with an alpha dominance that had driven her to her knees despite Celine's snarling resistance. "You dare to consort with an Omega," he had snarled, his lips forming each word with vicious clarity. "You dare to lower yourself to the level of the lowest pack members while refusing the attention of your betters? Your father will hear of this, princess, and you will learn what happens to wolves who forget their place." He had left Evan crumpled on the floor and dragged Lyra from the archives by her hair, ignoring her silent struggles and the horrified stares of the few pack members they passed in the corridors. He had taken her directly to the throne room where her father held court, had thrown her down on the stone steps leading to the dais where King Alistair sat in judgment, and had accused her of treason against the pack hierarchy. Lyra had tried to defend herself, had tried to sign that she had done nothing wrong. that Evan was simply a friend who treated her with respect, but Marcus had seized her wrists and held them immobile while he laid out his case. "The princess has been meeting in secret with an Omega scribe," he had said, his voice ringing through the hall for all the assembled courtiers to hear. "She has been sharing royal secrets with him, using her position to seduce him into betraying the crown's trust. I found them together in the archives, plotting in sign language so that no loyal wolf could understand their treachery. It had been a lie, a complete fabrication, but Lyra had no way to refute it. Her father had stared down at her with those cold gray eyes, his face expressionless, and she had seen in that moment that he believed Marcus without question, that he had perhaps always been waiting for an excuse to be rid of his defective daughter. "The guards will take you to the dungeons," Alistair had said, each word carefully enunciated so that Lyra could read his lips. "You will remain there until I decide what is to be done with you, and you will have no contact with anyone, especially not the Omega who has corrupted you." Lyra had wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all, but her voice had remained locked away as it always had, useless and silent. The guards had hauled her to her feet and dragged her from the throne room while the courtiers whispered among themselves, their faces a mixture of scandal and satisfaction, and Lyra had understood with perfect clarity that she had finally given them what they wanted, proof that she was as broken as they had always suspected. That had been 3 days ago, and she had been alone in this cell ever since with nothing but her thoughts and the rats that skittered through the shadows. No one had come to question her. No one had brought her more than stale bread and water once a day, and the isolation was beginning to fray the edges of her sanity. She had no idea what had happened to Evan, whether he was imprisoned somewhere else in the dungeons, or whether Marcus had simply had him executed as a traitor. The not knowing was almost worse than her own imprisonment. The fear that she had brought destruction down on an innocent man who had wanted nothing more than to treat her like a person. Celine paced restlessly in her mind, growling and snapping at the edges of Lyra's consciousness, demanding that they shift and fight their way out of this stone cage. But Lyra knew it was hopeless. The cell door was reinforced iron, impervious to claws, and even if she managed to escape the dungeons, she would never make it past the guards that patrolled the keep. She was trapped, well and truly, and for the first time in her life, she wondered if death might be preferable to the suffocating weight of her existence. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside her cell made her lift her head, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could not hear them, of course, but she could feel the vibration through the stone floor, heavy and deliberate, the tread of multiple wolves approaching with purpose. The cell door swung open and 4 guards entered, their faces impassive as they surrounded her. One of them held up a piece of parchment for her to read, and Lyra's blood turned to ice in her veins as she absorbed the words written there in her father's hand. "By order of King Alistair Ravenshade, Princess Lyra Ravenshade is hereby sentenced to death by ritual sacrifice to the moon goddess, said sacrifice to take place at dawn 3 days hence on the night of the dark moon. The princess is accused of treason against the pack, conspiracy with an Omega to undermine the crown, and willful corruption of sacred pack hierarchy. May the goddess have mercy on her soul." Lyra read the words 3 times, certain she must be misunderstanding, but the meaning remained clear. Her father was going to kill her, was going to dress it up as religious ceremony and execute his own daughter in front of the entire pack, as a warning to anyone else who might consider defying the rigid social order that kept wolves like Marcus in power. The ritual sacrifice was an ancient practice, supposedly a way to appease the moon goddess when the pack faced dire threat, but it had not been performed in over a century. The victim was meant to be offered willingly, a noble soul volunteering to save their people, but Lyra doubted anyone would care about that particular detail when the princess's blood soaked the sacrificial altar. One of the guards grabbed her arm and hauled her to her feet, and Lyra's knees nearly buckled beneath her. They removed her shackles only to replace them with silver chains that burned against her skin, suppressing her ability to shift and ensuring she could not call on Celine's strength. They led her from the cell and up through the dungeon corridors, past other prisoners who pressed their faces against the bars to watch her pass. and Lyra wondered distantly if any of them knew who she was, if any of them cared that their princess was being marched to her death. They brought her to a different cell, this one higher in the keep but no less prison-like, with a single narrow window that let in a shaft of gray morning light. The guards chained her to the wall and left without a word, locking the door behind them with the same terrible finality that had marked her first imprisonment. Lyra sank to the floor and stared at the window, at the small patch of sky visible beyond the iron bars, and she thought about her mother. Alara would have fought this, would have found some way to expose Marcus's lies and protect her daughter from this nightmare. But Alara was dead, had been dead for 14 years, and Lyra was alone with no allies and no voice to cry out for help. She closed her eyes and let her head fall back against the stone wall, and for the first time since her mother's funeral, she wished desperately that she could hear, if only to know what the world sounded like as it prepared to watch her die. Time lost meaning in that cell. Lyra could not tell how many hours passed, could not distinguish day from night beyond the fading and returning of the light through the window. Servants came twice with food that she could not bring herself to eat, their faces carefully blank as they set down the trays and left without attempting to communicate. She wondered if they pitied her, or if they thought she deserved this fate, if they believed Marcus's lies, or if they simply did not care enough to question the word of a beta against the silence of a princess no one had ever valued. On what she thought was the second day, the door opened and a figure entered that made Lyra's heart seize in her chest. It was not a guard or a servant, but Marcus himself, dressed in the formal robes of his position and wearing a smile that made her skin crawl. He dismissed the guards with a gesture and closed the door behind him, and Lyra pressed herself back against the wall, even though she knew there was nowhere to run. "I thought you might appreciate a visit," Marcus said, his lips forming the words with exaggerated care as if she were a child. "After all, we have so few days left together before your unfortunate demise. It seems a shame to waste them in silence." Lyra said nothing, did nothing, just stared at him with all the hatred she could pour into her gaze. Marcus seemed unbothered by her hostility, crossing the cell to crouch in front of her with a familiarity that made her want to vomit. "You know," he continued, "this could have all been avoided if you had simply accepted my affection. I would have made you a good mate, would have elevated you above your disability, and given you status as my Luna. But you chose to reject me, chose to throw yourself at an Omega scribe as if he could offer you anything of value. Such poor judgment, princess." He reached out and traced a finger down her cheek, and Lyra jerked her head away violently enough to make the chains rattle. Marcus laughed, a sound she could not hear but could see in the way his shoulders shook. "So much spirit still," he said. "What a waste. But perhaps it is for the best. The pack needs to see what happens to those who forget their place, and your death will serve as an excellent reminder. Your father has agreed to name me as his successor since he has no other heirs, and once I am king, I will ensure that no Omega ever rises above their station again. The hierarchy exists for a reason, and you will die to preserve it." He stood and moved toward the door, pausing to look back at her with something that might have been genuine regret, or might have been mockery. "I will be watching from the altar when they cut your throat," he said. "Try to die with some dignity, if you can manage it." Then he was gone, the door slamming shut behind him, and Lyra was alone again with the knowledge that her death was not just an execution, but a political maneuver, a way for Marcus to consolidate power and eliminate the one person who might have stood in his way. She thought about Evan, about the gentle way he had signed to her and the respect he had shown her when no one else would, and she wondered if he was already dead, if Marcus had killed him to tie up loose ends and ensure there were no witnesses to his crimes. The thought filled her with a rage so intense that Celine howled in her mind, battering against the silver chains that kept her contained. Lyra wanted to shift, wanted to tear Marcus apart with her claws and make him pay for every moment of suffering he had inflicted, but the silver burned against her skin and sapped her strength until she could barely hold herself upright. She must have fallen asleep at some point because she woke to darkness, the window showing only the faint light of stars beyond the bars. Her body ached from the chains and the hard floor, and her mouth was dry with thirst that the servants' meager offerings had not satisfied. She thought about the ritual that awaited her, about the altar in the sacred grove outside the keep where condemned wolves were sacrificed to the moon goddess, and she wondered if it would hurt, if the knife across her throat would be quick, or if they would make her suffer. And then she felt something she had not felt since her mother died, a presence in her mind that was not her own, a foreign consciousness brushing against hers with tentative curiosity. It was not Celine, not her wolf, but something else entirely, something that felt ancient and powerful and utterly impossible. Lyra's eyes snapped open, and she sat up as much as the chains would allow, her heart racing as she tried to understand what was happening. The presence grew stronger, more insistent, and with it came images that were not her own. A forest bathed in moonlight, a pack of wolves running together beneath the stars, and at the center of it all, a figure that glowed with silver light, neither fully wolf nor fully human. The moon goddess herself, Lyra thought wildly. But that was impossible. The goddess did not intervene in mortal affairs, did not speak to individual wolves no matter how desperate their prayers. But the images persisted, and with them came a feeling of such profound compassion that Lyra felt tears streaming down her face before she realized she was crying. The goddess, if that was truly who this was, did not speak in words, but in emotions and sensations, and what she communicated was both a comfort and a warning. You are not alone, the presence seemed to say. You have never been alone. And your silence is not weakness but strength, a gift I gave you so that you would learn to see the truth that others miss. But your time in the shadows is ending, child. Soon you will have to choose. Remain silent and die, or find your voice and live. The presence faded as suddenly as it had come, leaving Lyra gasping and shaking in her chains. She did not know if what she had experienced was real or a hallucination brought on by stress and hunger, but it had felt true in a way that nothing else in her life ever had. Find your voice, the goddess had said, but Lyra did not know how. She had been silent for so long that she did not even remember what her own voice sounded like, could not imagine the shape of words formed by her own lips and tongue. But perhaps that was not what the goddess had meant. Perhaps voice was not about sound, but about action, about refusing to be silenced by fear or shame or the weight of other people's expectations. Lyra had spent her entire life allowing others to define her, to tell her she was broken and useless, and better off hidden away, and she had accepted it because she had not known how to fight back. But sitting here in the darkness with death approaching like an inevitable tide, she realized that she was done accepting, done hiding, done allowing men like Marcus to write her story. If she was going to die, she would die on her own terms. And if by some miracle she survived, she would make sure that everyone who had wronged her paid for their crimes. The dawn of her execution arrived with gray light filtering through the window, and Lyra watched the sun rise over the mountains with a strange sense of calm. The guards came for her while the light was still pale and new, removing the chains from the wall but keeping her wrists and ankles bound in silver. They dressed her in a simple white robe, the traditional garment of a sacrifice, and one of them pushed her hair back from her face with surprising gentleness. They led her through the keep and out into the courtyard where the entire pack had assembled to watch her die. The courtyard was packed with wolves from every corner of the kingdom, their faces a blur of curiosity and judgment as Lyra was marched past them toward the gates. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear, even as her legs trembled beneath the weight of the silver chains. The morning air was cold against her skin, raising goosebumps along her arms, and she could smell the pine trees of the sacred grove beyond the walls, their scent sharp and clean in contrast to the musty odor of the dungeons that still clung to her hair. The procession moved slowly, deliberately, giving everyone ample time to witness the princess being led to her death like a common criminal. Lyra recognized faces in the crowd, courtiers who had ignored her for years, servants who had whispered behind their hands about her strangeness, and pack members who had never bothered to learn even the most basic signs to communicate with her. Not one of them met her eyes. Not one of them showed anything resembling sympathy or doubt about what was happening. They had all accepted Marcus's narrative without question, had all decided that she deserved this fate for daring to step outside the rigid boundaries that define their world. The sacred grove lay a quarter-mile from the keep, through a forest path that had been used for ceremonial purposes since long before Lyra's birth. The trees here were ancient, their trunks wider than 3 wolves standing side by side, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even at midday only scattered shafts of light penetrated to the forest floor. But it was dawn now, and the gray half-light made everything look washed out and unreal, like a nightmare from which Lyra could not wake. At the center of the grove stood the altar, a massive slab of black stone that had been carved with symbols of the moon goddess centuries ago. The stone was stained dark in the middle, generations of blood soaked into its porous surface, and Lyra felt her stomach turn as she realized that her blood would soon join that ancient accumulation. 4 stone pillars surrounded the altar, each topped with an iron ring, and the guards led her to the center and began securing her chains to those rings, spreading her arms and legs until she was splayed across the stone like a sacrifice laid out for a hungry god. The silver burned against her wrists and ankles, preventing any chance of shifting, and Lyra had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from showing pain. Selene was howling in her mind, throwing herself against the barriers the silver created, desperate to protect her human half from this violation. But there was nothing her wolf could do, no way to break free from chains that had been specifically designed to suppress shifter abilities. The pack began filing into the grove, forming a circle around the altar with her father and Marcus at the front. King Alistair was dressed in his formal robes of state, black velvet trimmed with silver thread that caught what little light filtered through the trees. His face was as cold and expressionless as ever, showing no indication that he was about to watch his only child die. Marcus stood beside him wearing the ceremonial garb of the high priest, a role he had assumed 3 years ago when the previous priest had died under mysterious circumstances. The white robes with their golden embroidery should have made him look holy, but to Lyra he only looked predatory, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction as he watched her struggle against the chains. Behind them stood the members of the royal council, 12 elder wolves who advised the king on matters of state and law. Lyra had always hated them, had recognized even as a child that they were the ones who had convinced her father to isolate her, to treat her deafness as a shameful secret rather than simply a difference. They had argued that a princess who could not hear could not rule, that she would be a liability in times of war or crisis, and Alistair had listened to them rather than to his own dying wife's pleas to give their daughter a chance. The rest of the pack spread out among the trees, hundreds of wolves all gathered to witness what Marcus had framed as justice, but what Lyra knew was nothing more than murder dressed up in ritual. She scanned the crowd desperately, looking for any sign of Evan, any indication that he was still alive, but she could not find his face among the masses. The fear that he was already dead, that Marcus had killed him days ago, and she had been too isolated to know, made her chest tighten with grief so intense it was almost physical. Marcus stepped forward, climbing the 3 stone steps that led up to the altar, and the crowd fell silent in response to some signal Lyra could not perceive. She watched his lips as he began to speak, reading the formal words of the sacrifice ritual with a focus born of desperation. "We gather here in the sacred grove on this dark moon to offer a life to the goddess," he said, his hands gesturing dramatically as if he were performing for an audience rather than conducting a holy ceremony. "Princess Lyra Ravenshade has been found guilty of treason against her pack, of conspiring with those beneath her station to undermine the natural order that the goddess herself established. Her crimes have brought shame upon the crown and threatened the stability of our kingdom. Therefore, in accordance with ancient law, she will be given to the goddess as payment for her sins." He paused, letting his words sink in, and Lyra saw several pack members nodding in agreement. They believed him, she realized with sick certainty. They actually believed that she had committed treason, that her friendship with Evan had been some kind of conspiracy. Or perhaps they simply did not care whether it was true, as long as it gave them entertainment and reinforced their belief in the superiority of alphas over omegas. "The goddess demands purity," Marcus continued, "and what is more pure than royal blood spilled in her name?" Princess Lyra's death will cleanse the pack of corruption and restore the balance that has been disturbed by her defiance. Let all who witness this sacrifice remember the price of stepping outside one's proper place. He drew a ceremonial knife from his belt, the blade gleaming silver in the gray light, and Lyra's heart began to race despite her determination to face death with courage. The knife was long and curved, designed specifically for cutting throats quickly and efficiently, and she could see dark stains along its edge that suggested it had been used for this purpose before. Marcus moved to stand beside her head, the knife held in both hands above his chest, and Lyra looked up at him with all the hatred and defiance she could muster. She would not beg. She would not cry. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. But before Marcus could bring the knife down, something shifted in the air of the grove. Lyra felt it first as a tingling along her skin, a sensation like static electricity building before a storm, and then as a pressure in her chest that made it hard to breathe. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches creaking though there was no wind, and the gray light filtering through the canopy took on a strange, silvery quality that hurt to look at directly. Marcus hesitated, the knife wavering in his hands, and Lyra saw confusion flash across his face. The pack members began murmuring among themselves, their voices creating a vibration she could feel through the stone altar, even though she could not hear the words. Something was wrong, she realized. Something was happening that was not part of the planned ceremony. And then the moon goddess appeared. She did not manifest physically, not exactly, but her presence filled the grove so completely that every wolf present could feel it pressing down on them like a weight. The air grew thick and charged, shimmering with silver light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. The symbols carved into the altar began to glow, white light seeping up through the blood-dark stone, and Lyra felt warmth spreading through her body despite the cold morning air. The goddess spoke, not in words that could be heard, but in a voice that resonated directly in the mind of every wolf present. And even Lyra, who could not hear in the traditional sense, received her message with perfect clarity. "This sacrifice is a mockery," the goddess said, her tone carrying both grief and rage. "This child is no criminal. She has committed no treason. She has been condemned by lies spoken by those who fear what she represents. Change, compassion, the possibility that strength can exist in forms you do not recognize." The pack fell to their knees as one, overwhelmed by the divine presence, and even Marcus stumbled backward from the altar, the ceremonial knife clattering to the stone. Only King Alistair remained standing, though Lyra could see him trembling with the effort, his face gone pale as ash. "I gave Lyra her silence as a gift," the goddess continued, "not as a curse. I made her deaf so that she would learn to see truth where others only hear pretty lies. I made her mute so that she would learn the value of words and use them only when they matter most. And I have watched with growing anger as you wolves who claim to serve me have twisted my gift into an excuse for cruelty and exclusion." The light around the altar intensified, and Lyra felt the silver chains beginning to heat against her skin. But instead of burning, the metal started to soften, to melt away like ice under a summer sun, and within seconds her wrists and ankles were free. She sat up slowly, hardly daring to believe what was happening, and found herself face to face with a manifestation of the goddess herself, a figure made of silver light in the shape of a woman with wolf's eyes. "Rise, child," the goddess said, and Lyra obeyed without thinking, sliding off the altar to stand on shaking legs. The white sacrificial robe she wore had transformed, the simple fabric now embroidered with silver thread that formed patterns of moons and wolves running beneath stars. She looked down at herself in wonder, then back up at the goddess who regarded her with infinite compassion. "You have a choice before you," the divine voice said. "You can leave this place, flee into the forest and live your life in peace far from those who have hurt you. Or you can stay and fight for what is right. Use your voice to expose the corruption that has infected this court and demand the justice you deserve. The choice is yours alone, and I will support whichever path you take." Lyra's mind raced. Part of her wanted desperately to run, to disappear into the trees and never look back, to leave behind the pain and betrayal, and the crushing weight of expectations she could never meet. But another part of her, the part that had been growing stronger since the day Evan had signed "I See You," refused to let Marcus win, refused to let her mother's death go unavenged, refused to abandon the few people in this kingdom who might actually need her. She turned to face her father and the assembled pack, and for the first time in 14 years, she opened her mouth and let sound emerge. Her voice was rough from disuse, the words awkwardly formed after so long without practice, but they were clear enough for everyone to understand. "I will stay," she said, and the shock on every face in the grove was almost worth the years of silence that had preceded this moment. "I will stay, and I will fight. Because this kingdom is sick, poisoned by men like Marcus who use tradition and hierarchy to hide their crimes, and I will not let my mother's murder go unpunished any longer." The goddess smiled, an expression of such pride and love that Lyra felt tears streaming down her face. "Then speak your truth, child," she said. "Tell them what you know, and I will ensure they listen." Lyra took a deep breath, gathering her courage, and began to sign as she spoke, using both languages simultaneously so that there could be no misunderstanding. "My mother was murdered," she said, her hands shaping the words with fierce precision. "Queen Alara did not die of a weak heart. She was poisoned during a council meeting 14 years ago. And I know this because I watched her try to tell me with her dying breath. She signed the name of her killer, but I was 5 years old and too traumatized to understand what she was showing me. It was only years later, when I had taught myself to read ancient texts in the royal archives, that I found the symbol she had made, the mark of the Thornwood family. Every eye in the grove turned to Marcus, who had gone white as the sacrificial robes he wore. He opened his mouth to protest, to deny the accusation, but before he could speak, the goddess raised one hand and his voice died in his throat. "Continue," the divine presence commanded Lyra, and she obeyed. "Marcus poisoned my mother because she discovered that he had been embezzling from the royal treasury for years, stealing funds meant for the pack's welfare and using them to buy loyalty among the council members. She was going to expose him at that meeting, was going to demand that my father investigate and remove him from his position. So he killed her, slipped wolfsbane into her wine during the midday meal, and watched her die knowing that no one would question the death of a woman rumored to have a weak constitution." Marcus found his voice enough to shake his head violently, gesturing toward Lyra as if she were mad. "Lies," he managed to rasp out. "The princess is delusional. Everyone knows she has been unstable since her mother's death. She has no proof of these accusations." Lyra smiled, cold and sharp. "I have proof," she said. "I have the ledgers my mother kept hidden in a secret compartment in her chambers. Ledgers that document every theft, every bribe, every crime Marcus has committed over the past 20 years. I found them 3 years ago while searching for some memento of her, and I have kept them safe ever since, waiting for the day when I would be strong enough to use them." "Where are these supposed ledgers?" King Alistair demanded, speaking for the first time since the ceremony had begun. His voice was steady, but his eyes were wild, darting between Lyra and Marcus as if trying to determine who was telling the truth. "They are in the royal archives," Lyra said, "in a locked chest beneath the 3rd shelf in the eastern reading room. The key is hidden behind a loose stone in my mother's chambers, the one carved with a rose. And if you send wolves you trust to retrieve them, you will find everything you need to convict Marcus of treason and murder." The king gestured to 4 guards, wolves Lyra recognized as loyal to the crown rather than to Marcus, and they rushed from the grove toward the keep. The remaining pack members watched in stunned silence, the energy of the mob that had been baying for Lyra's blood now uncertain and fractured. Marcus seemed to realize that his position was becoming untenable. His face twisted with rage, and he lunged for Lyra, his hands extended as if to strangle her where she stood. But before he could reach her, a figure burst from the crowd and threw itself between them, blocking Marcus's attack with his own body. Evan Hartwood stumbled and nearly fell as Marcus's momentum carried them both backward, but he kept his feet and shoved the beta away with surprising strength for an omega. He was battered and bruised, his face showing clear signs of recent violence, and his gray robes were torn and stained with blood. but his eyes were fierce as he positioned himself protectively in front of Lyra, his hands already forming signs. "She speaks the truth," he signed, his movements sharp and angry. "I found documents in the archives that reference payments to council members, documents that Marcus tried to destroy when he realized I had seen them. That is why he accused the princess of conspiracy, why he had me beaten and thrown into the dungeons to die. He knew that between the two of us we could piece together his crimes and expose him." Marcus snarled and tried to rush Evan again, but this time King Alistair himself stepped forward and seized the beta by the throat, his alpha dominance crashing down so hard that Marcus was driven to his knees. "Explain yourself," the king growled, and even Lyra could feel the power in his voice reverberating through the grove. "Explain to me why I should not rip your throat out here and now for daring to harm my daughter." "Your daughter is defective," Marcus spat, his face purple with rage and lack of air. "She has always been defective, a stain on your legacy, and a weakness that your enemies will exploit. I did what was necessary to protect the kingdom from her incompetence. By murdering my mate," Alistair said, and his voice had gone deadly quiet. "By poisoning the woman I loved and then spending 14 years convincing me that my daughter was the problem rather than the solution. You are right that I have been weak, Marcus, but not in the way you think. I have been weak because I listened to you and your sycophants on the council, instead of listening to the one person who might have seen through your lies, if I had only given her a chance." He released Marcus with a contemptuous shove that sent the beta sprawling in the dirt. "Guards," he called, "arrest this traitor and take him to the dungeons. He will await trial for the murder of Queen Alara and for treason against the crown. And if the ledgers my daughter mentioned prove her accusations, he will be executed at the next full moon." The guards moved forward and seized Marcus, who fought briefly before submitting to the inevitable. As they dragged him from the grove, he turned his head to stare at Lyra with such pure hatred that she felt it like a physical blow. "This is not over," he mouthed, the words clear on his lips. "You may have won today, but there are others who share my beliefs, others who will ensure that the natural order is maintained." Then he was gone, disappearing down the forest path toward the keep, and Lyra was left standing in the sacred grove with the entire pack staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. The goddess's presence had faded somewhat, no longer the overwhelming force it had been, but Lyra could still feel her approval like a warm hand on her shoulder. "You have done well," the divine voice whispered in her mind, "but your work is far from finished." Marcus spoke truth when he said there are others who share his prejudices. "You will have to fight to change this kingdom, to tear down the walls that separate Omega from Alpha and create a new order built on justice rather than arbitrary hierarchy. Are you prepared for that battle?" Lyra looked at Evan, who was watching her with concern and something that might have been admiration, and she thought about all the years she had spent hiding in silence, allowing others to define her worth. She thought about her mother, who had died trying to protect the pack from corruption, and about all the other wolves who had suffered under Marcus's rule because they were not born into the right rank. "Yes," she signed, the gesture firm and unwavering. "I am ready." The goddess smiled one last time, her form dissolving into silver light that scattered through the grove like falling snow, and then she was gone completely, leaving only the normal gray morning in her wake. But the pack members who had witnessed her appearance would never forget what they had seen, would never again be able to claim that the hierarchy they served was divinely ordained. King Alistair approached Lyra slowly, his movements hesitant as if he were not sure how she would respond. When he reached her, he did something she had not expected. He knelt, lowering himself until his eyes were level with hers, and he lifted his hands in the formal signs of the Wolf Kingdoms. "I have been a terrible father," he signed, his movements stiff with disuse but clear enough to understand. "I allowed my grief over your mother's death to blind me to your suffering. I listened to Marcus when I should have listened to you. I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I am asking for it anyway, because I want the chance to know my daughter before it is too late." Lyra stared at him, torn between the anger she had carried for 14 years and the desperate child inside her who had always wanted her father's love. She looked at his face, really looked at it for the first time in years, and she saw that he had aged badly since Alara's death. Deep lines carved around his eyes and mouth, gray threading through his black hair. He looked exhausted, she realized, like a man who had been carrying an impossible burden for too long. "You hurt me," she signed back, her hands trembling slightly. "You made me feel like I was worthless, like my silence was something to be ashamed of rather than simply a part of who I am. You let Marcus abuse me and you did nothing to stop it. How can I forgive that?" "You cannot," Alistair signed, "and you should not. But perhaps over time, you could learn to trust me again. I want to make amends, Lyra. I want to be the father your mother believed I could be before grief and manipulation destroyed me. Will you give me that chance?" Lyra considered for a long moment, aware that the entire pack was watching this exchange. Finally, she signed, "I will give you one chance. But if you betray me again, if you choose politics or pride over my welfare, I will leave and you will never see me again. Do you understand?" "I understand," her father signed, and she saw tears in his eyes for the first time since her mother's funeral. "Thank you." He rose and turned to address the pack, his voice ringing out across the grove. "My daughter has spoken truth today, and in doing so she has exposed corruption that has poisoned this kingdom for too long. I declare here before the goddess and all witnesses that the old hierarchy is dissolved. No longer will Omega wolves be treated as lesser. No longer will rank determine worth. From this day forward, every member of this pack will be judged by their character and actions, not by the circumstances of their birth." The pronouncement sent shockwaves through the assembled wolves. Some looked pleased, even relieved, but others appeared angry or confused, clearly disturbed by this sudden upending of the social order they had known their entire lives. Lyra knew that her father's decree would not be enough to change hearts and minds overnight, that there would be resistance and possibly even violence from those who benefited from the old system, but it was a start. Evan moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and comforting, and Lyra reached out to take his hand without thinking. The gesture sent another ripple of shock through the crowd, the princess publicly claiming an Omega as her companion, but she found she did not care what they thought. Evan had been the first person in 14 years to see her as something other than broken, and she would not hide that connection to preserve the sensibilities of wolves who had never cared about her anyway. Her father noticed the joined hands, but said nothing, merely nodding as if he had expected it. "We will return to the keep," he announced. "The council will convene immediately to discuss the evidence against Marcus and to begin the work of restructuring our laws. Princess Lyra and Omega Evan will attend as honored advisors, and anyone who objects to their presence will be removed from their position." The pack began to disperse, filing out of the grove in small groups that whispered among themselves. Lyra caught fragments of conversation as they passed. Wolves debating whether what they had witnessed was real or some kind of mass hallucination, whether the princess had actually spoken or if they had imagined her voice. She wanted to laugh at their confusion, at the way their certainty had been shaken so completely in the space of a single morning. As the grove emptied, Lyra found herself alone with Evan and her father, the three of them standing in the shadow of the altar that had almost claimed her life. She looked at the black stone, at the silver chains still lying where they had fallen, and she shuddered at how close she had come to death. "Are you hurt?" Evan signed, his free hand gentle as he touched her arm. "Did they harm you in the dungeons?" Lyra shook her head. "I am whole," she signed back. "But you are injured. What did Marcus do to you?" Evan's expression darkened. "He had me beaten when I tried to defend you in the archives. Then he threw me into the dungeons and told the guards to let me starve. I thought I was going to die down there, thought I would never see you again. But this morning they dragged me out and brought me to the grove, said that Marcus wanted me to watch your execution as punishment for corrupting you." Lyra felt rage building in her chest again, hot and fierce. "Marcus will pay for what he did to you," she signed. "I will make certain of it." Evan smiled, tired but genuine. "You already have," he signed. "You stood up to him, exposed his crimes, and survived when he tried to kill you. That is victory enough." King Alistair cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "We should return to the keep," he said aloud, then repeated in sign when he saw Lyra's expectant expression. "There is much to be done, and I suspect Marcus's allies on the council will not go quietly. We need to prepare for resistance." Lyra nodded and began walking toward the path that led back to the castle, Evan falling into step beside her. Her father followed a few paces behind, giving them space but clearly unwilling to let his daughter out of his sight. As they walked, Lyra thought about the goddess's words, about the battles that still lay ahead, and the work required to truly change the kingdom. She was not naive enough to think that a single dramatic confrontation would solve everything. There would be wolves who refused to accept the new order, who would fight to preserve their privileges and power. There would be attempts to undermine her father's decree, to find loopholes and exceptions that would maintain the status quo. And there would always be those who looked at her deafness as a weakness, who questioned whether she was truly capable of the role she was claiming. But Lyra was done being afraid of judgment, done allowing fear to dictate her choices. She had survived Marcus's attempt to murder her, had faced down death itself and emerged stronger. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would meet them with the same courage that had allowed her to speak when silence would have been easier. They reached the keep as the sun finally broke through the cloud cover, bathing the gray stone walls in golden light that seemed almost prophetic. Servants and guards lined the corridors as they passed, their expressions ranging from awe to uncertainty to barely concealed hostility. Word of what had happened in the sacred grove was already spreading through the castle, carried by pack members who had witnessed the goddess's appearance and Lyra's dramatic accusations against Marcus. Her father led them to the council chambers, a large room dominated by a circular table where the 12 elder wolves who advised the king traditionally gathered. But when they arrived, Lyra found that only 8 of the council members were present, the others conspicuously absent. Those who remained looked nervous, their eyes darting between the king and Lyra as if trying to determine which way the political winds were blowing. Alistair took his seat at the head of the table and gestured for Lyra and Evan to sit on either side of him, positions traditionally reserved for the highest-ranking pack members. Several of the council members exchanged glances at this breach of protocol, but none dared to voice objections after what they had witnessed in the grove. "The guards I sent to retrieve my late mate's ledgers have returned," Alistair announced without preamble. They found exactly what Princess Lyra described: detailed records of financial crimes spanning 2 decades, including payments made to 4 members of this council in exchange for their support of Beta Marcus's policies and their silence regarding his theft. He slammed a stack of leather-bound journals onto the table with enough force to make several council members flinch. "The 4 of you whose names appear in these pages have one opportunity to confess your involvement and cooperate with the investigation. If you do so, you may face exile rather than execution. If you choose to deny your crimes, I will show you the same mercy Marcus showed my mate. None whatsoever." There was a long silence during which Lyra watched the guilty parties squirm in their seats. Finally, one of them, an elderly wolf named Aldrich who had served on the council since before Lyra was born, rose slowly to his feet. "I confess," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus approached me 12 years ago with an offer. Support his proposal to limit Omega rights in exchange for gold that would secure my family's failing estate. I took the money, and I voted as he asked, and I have regretted it every day since. I do not ask for forgiveness, only for the opportunity to make amends in whatever way you deem appropriate." One by one, the other 3 implicated council members stood and offered similar confessions, their voices heavy with shame. Lyra felt no satisfaction in their disgrace, only a weary sadness that so many lives had been damaged by greed and cowardice. These were not evil wolves, she realized, merely weak ones who had made terrible choices when presented with temptation. "You will be stripped of your council positions immediately," Alistair said once the last confession had been delivered. "Your assets will be seized to repay the treasury for what was stolen, and you will be exiled from the kingdom by the next full moon. If you ever return, you will be executed on sight. Is that understood?" The 4 wolves nodded miserably and filed from the chamber, leaving only 4 loyal council members remaining at the table. Lyra recognized them as wolves her mother had trusted, Older pack members who had argued against Marcus's policies even when it cost them politically. "We need to rebuild this council," her father said, addressing the remaining members. "I want wolves who value justice over tradition, who understand that strength comes in many forms, and who will advise me honestly even when the truth is uncomfortable. I am asking each of you to recommend candidates for the empty positions, with particular attention to including Omega wolves who have been excluded from leadership roles until now." One of the council members, a sharp-eyed woman named Helena, leaned forward with interest. "You mean to truly dismantle the hierarchy," she said. "Not just make symbolic gestures, but actually restructure how power is distributed in the pack." "That is exactly what I mean," Alistair confirmed. "My daughter was right when she said this kingdom is sick. The poison Marcus spread went deeper than financial corruption. He convinced us all that some wolves are inherently worth more than others based purely on the rank they were born into. And we accepted that lie because it benefited those of us born as alphas or betas. But the goddess herself appeared today to tell us we were wrong, and I will not ignore her message." Lyra felt a surge of pride in her father's words, even as she remained cautious about trusting him completely. Talk was easy, she knew. The real test would come when he faced opposition from powerful alphas who had built their entire lives on the assumption of their superiority. As if reading her thoughts, Helena spoke again. "You know this will not be accepted quietly," she said. "There are packs throughout the kingdom who will see these changes as weakness, who will view your decree as an invitation to challenge your authority. You may face rebellion, even civil war. Then we will face it," Alistair said firmly. "And we will win, because we will have something our enemies lack. We will be fighting for a just cause rather than defending an unjust system. The packs who oppose change will be fighting only to preserve their own privilege, and that is a weak foundation on which to build an army." Lyra raised her hands to sign, and the room fell silent as everyone's attention turned to her. "What about education?" she signed, her movements deliberate and clear. "If you truly want to change hearts and minds, you need to start with the young. Require all wolf pups to learn sign language alongside spoken language. Teach them that difference is not deficiency, that there are many ways to be strong and valuable to the pack. Create a generation that grows up understanding equality as the natural state rather than hierarchy." Her father's eyes widened slightly, and she saw respect dawning in his expression. "That is brilliant," he signed back, then repeated aloud for those council members who did not know sign language. "We will implement that immediately. Helena, I want you to work with the teachers and scholars to develop a curriculum that includes sign language as a required subject. Any school or tutor who refuses to teach it will lose their position." Helena nodded, already making notes on a piece of parchment. "What else?" she asked, looking at Lyra with genuine interest. "What other changes would you recommend, Princess?" Lyra thought for a moment, then signed rapidly, forcing her father to translate. "Abolish arranged marriages based on rank. Allow wolves to choose their own mates, regardless of whether they are alpha, beta, or omega. Create legal protections for omega wolves who have been abused by those of higher rank, and establish penalties severe enough to actually deter future abuse. Open all positions of authority, including council seats and military command, to wolves of any rank based on merit rather than birth. And create a system where grievances against nobles can be heard by impartial judges rather than the nobles themselves." The council members were scribbling frantically, trying to keep up with the flood of proposals. Evan was watching Lyra with undisguised admiration, his eyes shining with emotion, and she felt heat rising in her cheeks under his gaze. "These are all excellent suggestions," Alistair said when she had finished. "We will begin drafting legislation to address each point. But implementation will take time, and in the meantime we need to deal with the immediate threat of Marcus's allies. I have no doubt that there are wolves in this castle and beyond who share his views and who will try to undermine our reforms or even take revenge for his imprisonment." As if summoned by his words, a guard burst into the council chamber, his face pale with alarm. "Your Majesty," he gasped, "Marcus has escaped. He overpowered the dungeon guards and fled into the forest. We have trackers searching for him now, but he has several hours head start." Lyra's blood ran cold. "How?" she signed urgently. How did he escape? He should have been in silver chains to prevent shifting. The guard looked uncomfortable. Someone helped him, he admitted. One of the dungeon guards was found unconscious with his keys missing and a message carved into the wall of Marcus's cell. It said, "The old order will be restored. We will not let the kingdom fall to Omega filth." Alistair slammed his fist on the table hard enough to crack the wood. Find out which guard was working with him and arrest everyone on that shift for questioning. I want every entrance to the keep doubled, and I want patrols sent out to every known sanctuary where Marcus might seek refuge, and send word to the neighboring packs that he is a wanted criminal who is to be captured on sight. The guard saluted and rushed from the room, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Lyra felt Celine stirring anxiously in her mind, her wolf's instincts screaming that they were in danger, that Marcus would not simply flee, but would return with allies to finish what he had started. "He will come for me," she signed, the certainty settling over her like a shroud. "He knows that as long as I am alive, I represent everything he hates, and he will not rest until I am dead and the old hierarchy is restored." "Then we will not make it easy for him," her father said, his jaw set with determination. "You will have guards with you at all times, and you will not leave the keep under any circumstances until Marcus is found. I will not lose you again, Lyra. Not when I have only just gotten you back." Lyra wanted to argue, wanted to insist that hiding would solve nothing, but she recognized the fear beneath her father's authoritative tone and decided to save her rebellion for a battle that mattered more. She nodded her acceptance, and Alistair visibly relaxed. The council meeting continued for several more hours as they hammered out the details of the reforms Lyra had proposed. She found herself drawn into passionate debates about implementation, about how to balance the need for swift change against the reality of deeply ingrained prejudices. The council members who remained were surprisingly open to her input, treating her ideas with respect rather than dismissing them as the naive fantasies of a sheltered princess. It was exhilarating and exhausting in equal measure, and by the time the meeting finally adjourned in the late afternoon, Lyra felt wrung out like a dish rag. Evan had remained beside her throughout, occasionally adding his own observations from his perspective as an Omega who had experienced the hierarchy's cruelties firsthand. His contributions were valuable, offering insights that the noble-born council members would never have considered, and Lyra saw several of them nodding thoughtfully at his words. When they finally left the council chamber, Alistair pulled Lyra aside while Evan waited a respectful distance away. "I meant what I said about wanting to know you," he signed, his movements uncertain as if he feared rejection. "Would you have dinner with me tonight? Just the two of us? I know I have no right to ask, but I would like the chance to hear about your life, about the years I wasted pushing you away." Lyra studied her father's face, seeing genuine regret etched in every line, and she felt her anger softening despite her best efforts to hold on to it. "Yes," she signed finally, "but Evan comes too. He has been more of a family to me in the past few weeks than you have been in 14 years, and I will not exclude him to make you comfortable." Her father's expression flickered with something that might have been hurt, but he nodded acceptance. "Of course," he signed. "Evan is welcome. I would like to know him as well, since he clearly means a great deal to you." They arranged to meet in the private dining room at sunset, and Lyra made her way back to her chambers with Evan and an escort of 4 guards her father had assigned for her protection. The corridors were unusually empty, most of the pack members presumably still reeling from the day's dramatic events, and Lyra was grateful for the relative quiet. When they reached her chambers, she dismissed the guards to wait outside and pulled Evan into the sitting room, closing the door behind them for a moment of privacy. The space looked exactly as she had left it before being dragged to the dungeons, her sketches still scattered across the desk and her books piled haphazardly on every surface, but it felt different now, less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. "Thank you," she signed to Evan, who had collapsed onto the sofa with a groan of exhaustion, "for standing up for me in the grove, for putting yourself in danger when you could have stayed silent and safe." Evan smiled tiredly. "I could never stay silent when you needed me," he signed back. "You showed me what courage looks like when you spoke today, when you used your voice for the first time to expose Marcus's crimes." How could I do any less? Lyra sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and for a long moment they simply breathed together in comfortable silence. Then Evan turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "What happens now?" he signed. "Between us, I mean. Everything has changed so quickly, and I do not know what you want or what is even possible given our different ranks." Lyra reached out and took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "The hierarchy is being dismantled," she signed with her free hand. "Soon rank will not matter, and we will be free to choose our own path. And I choose you, Evan, if you will have me." His answering smile was like sunrise breaking over mountains. "I have chosen you since the moment I signed I see you in the archives," he signed. "I just never dared to hope you might feel the same." She leaned forward and kissed him, tentative at first, and then with growing confidence as he responded with equal enthusiasm. It was her first kiss, clumsy and inexpert, but it felt perfect in its honesty. Two people who had found each other against all odds finally allowing themselves to acknowledge what had been building between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Evan rested his forehead against hers with a soft laugh. "Your father is going to kill me," he signed. "An Omega kissing the princess before they are properly mated. I will be lucky if he only exiles me." Lyra grinned, fierce and wild. "Then he will have to exile me too," she signed, "because I am not giving you up for anyone, not even the king." They spent the next hour simply talking, sharing stories about their lives and their hopes for the future. Evan told her about growing up in a small village on the border of the kingdom, about the sister who had been born deaf and who had taught him sign language out of necessity. He spoke of watching her struggle against a world that saw her disability as a weakness, and of his determination to become an archivist so that he could preserve the stories of wolves like her who were too often forgotten by history. Lyra in turn told him about her mother, about the journals they had filled together, and the plans Alara had made for her daughter's future, before Marcus had cut them short. She confessed her fear that she would not be strong enough to lead the changes her father wanted to implement, that the pack would never truly accept a deaf princess no matter how many laws were passed in her favor. "You are already stronger than you know," Evan signed gently. "You survived years of isolation and abuse, maintained your sense of self when everyone around you tried to convince you that you were broken, and then stood before the entire pack and spoke truth in the face of death itself. If that is not strength, I do not know what is." His faith in her was humbling, and Lyra found herself blinking back tears for the second time that day. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door, and one of the guards called out that it was time for dinner with the king. They made their way to the private dining room, a smaller space than the formal banquet hall, but still elegantly appointed with tapestries depicting the history of the Ravenshade line. Alistair was already seated at the head of the table, dressed in simpler clothing than his formal robes, and he stood when they entered with a gesture of respect that made Lyra's eyebrows rise. "Thank you for coming," he signed, then spoke aloud for Evan's benefit as well. "Please sit. I have asked the kitchen to prepare some of your favorite dishes, Lyra, though I confess I am not entirely certain what those are anymore." The admission was painful in its honesty, an acknowledgement of how little he actually knew about his own daughter. But Lyra appreciated the effort, settling into her seat with Evan beside her, while servants brought out course after course of beautifully prepared food. The meal was awkward at first, long silences punctuated by stilted attempts at conversation, but gradually they found their rhythm. Alistair asked Evan about his work in the archives, and the Omega's passion for preserving history drew the king into an animated discussion about ancient texts and forgotten lore. Lyra watched them talk and felt something tight in her chest beginning to loosen, a hope that perhaps her family could be rebuilt from these broken pieces. When the conversation turned to her, Lyra found herself telling her father about her sketches, about the way she saw the world in lines and shadows when words failed her. She described the forests she had drawn from memory, the wolves running beneath moons she could only imagine, and she saw his eyes grow bright with unshed tears. "Your mother used to draw too," he signed when she had finished. "She would sketch me when she thought I was not looking, always managing to capture something in my expression that I did not know I was showing. I burned all her drawings after she died, because I could not bear to look at them. But now I wished desperately that I had kept them. Lyra felt her throat tighten with emotion. I have some of her drawings, she signed, hidden in my chambers. Sketches of you and me and the gardens she loved. I will show them to you, if you want. I would like that very much, Alistair signed, and this time he did not bother to hide the tears that slipped down his cheeks. The rest of the evening passed in easier conversation, old wounds beginning to heal through the simple act of honest communication. When Lyra finally returned to her chambers that night, exhausted but strangely hopeful, she found that someone had left a package on her bed. Inside was a leather journal identical to the ones her mother had used, along with a note in her father's handwriting. For your thoughts and sketches. May you fill many of these in the years to come. With love, your father. She clutched the journal to her chest and let herself cry. Great heaving sobs that she could not hear, but could feel in every fiber of her being. Celine stirred in her mind, offering comfort through their bond, and Lyra allowed herself to sink into her wolf's steady presence. Tomorrow there would be more challenges, more battles to fight against those who opposed change. Marcus was still out there somewhere, plotting his revenge, and the kingdom was far from stable. But tonight, for the first time in 14 years, Lyra felt like she had a family again, like she had allies who saw her as more than just a problem to be managed. And she had Evan, whose gentle presence had cracked open the walls she had built around her heart and shown her that love was possible even in the darkest circumstances. She fell asleep with the journal still in her arms, dreaming of a future where deaf princesses could rule kingdoms and Omega wolves could stand as equals beside alphas, where strength was measured by character rather than rank, and where every voice, whether spoken or signed, could be heard. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity as the king's reforms began to take shape. Lyra found herself thrust into a role she had never expected, serving as her father's chief advisor on matters relating to Omega rights and accessibility. She attended every council meeting, offered input on every proposed law, and worked tirelessly with Evan to draft policies that would truly level the playing field between ranks. Not everyone was happy with the changes. Several noble families withdrew their support from the crown, declaring that they would not serve a king who had betrayed the natural order. 2 minor pacts on the kingdom's borders announced their intention to secede and form their own territory where traditional hierarchy would be maintained. And there were whispers in the corridors of the keep, muttered complaints about the deaf princess who had bewitched the king and led him astray from the old ways. But for every wolf who resisted, there were 3 more who embraced the new order with relief and gratitude. Omega wolves who had spent their entire lives being treated as servants or breeding stock found themselves suddenly offered opportunities for education and advancement. Families who had been torn apart by forced matings based on rank were able to reunite with their chosen partners. And young wolves who had grown up believing they were worthless simply because of the circumstances of their birth discovered that they had value and potential beyond what they had ever imagined. Lyra threw herself into the work with single-minded determination, spending her days in council meetings and her evenings drafting new legislation with Evan's help. They had become inseparable, the princess and the Omega scribe, and though some pack members still whispered about the impropriety of their relationship, no one dared to challenge it openly after the king made his support clear. But Marcus's escape cast a long shadow over everything. Despite extensive searches, no trace of the disgraced Beta had been found, and Lyra knew it was only a matter of time before he resurfaced with a plan to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. She doubled her guards, varied her routines, and learned to sleep with one eye open, always waiting for the attack she knew was coming. It came on the night of the full moon, exactly 3 weeks after the failed sacrifice in the sacred grove. Lyra was in the royal library with Evan when the first explosion shook the keep. The ancient building trembled, dust raining down from the vaulted ceiling as the sound of shattering stone echoed through the corridors. She could not hear the blast itself, but she felt it through every bone in her body, a concussive force that knocked books from their shelves and sent her stumbling into Evan's arms. "What was that?" she signed frantically, her heart already racing with adrenaline. Evan's face had gone white with fear as he strained to hear something beyond her perception, and when he turned back to her, His hands were shaking. "An attack," he signed. "Multiple explosions at the main gates. And I can hear fighting, screams. We need to get you to safety now." Before Lyra could respond, the library doors burst open and 4 of her guards rushed in, their swords already drawn. "Princess," the captain signed urgently, "we are under attack by rebel forces. Beta Marcus has returned with an army of wolves who support the old hierarchy. They have breached the outer walls and are fighting their way toward the keep. The king has ordered us to evacuate you to the safe room immediately." Lyra's mind raced. The safe room was a fortified chamber deep beneath the keep, designed to protect the royal family during sieges. But the thought of hiding while her father and loyal pack members fought and died made her stomach turn. "No," she signed decisively. "I will not hide like a coward while others fight for the future we have been building. Take me to my father. I need to know what is happening." The guards exchanged uncertain glances, clearly torn between following orders and respecting her wishes. Finally, the captain nodded. "As you command, Princess. But stay close to us and do exactly as we say. The rebels are specifically targeting you, and if they capture you, they will use you to force the king to surrender." They moved quickly through the corridors, Evan staying pressed close to Lyra's side while the guards formed a protective circle around them. The keep was in chaos, servants running in all directions and soldiers rushing to defensive positions. Through the windows, Lyra caught glimpses of the courtyard below, where fighting had already erupted between the royal guard and wolves in mismatched armor who must have been Marcus's rebel forces. She saw wolves shifting mid-battle, fur and fangs replacing human form as the conflict devolved into primal savagery. Blood stained the cobblestones and bodies lay scattered where they had fallen, both rebel and loyalist alike. The sight made Lyra's gorge rise, but she forced herself to keep moving, to focus on reaching her father, rather than dwelling on the carnage. They found King Alistair in the throne room, surrounded by his most trusted commanders as they coordinated the defense. He looked up as Lyra entered, and his expression shifted from relief to anger in the space of a heartbeat. "What are you doing here?" he signed sharply. "I ordered you taken to safety. You should be in the safe room, not wandering the halls where Marcus's assassins can reach you." "I am not wandering," Lyra signed back with equal sharpness. "I am here to help defend my home. Tell me what I can do." Her father looked like he wanted to argue, but another explosion rocked the keep, and he clearly decided they did not have time for the debate. "Fine," he signed tersely. "But you stay in this room under heavy guard, and if I give the order to retreat, you will obey without question. Understood?" Lyra nodded, though she had no intention of abandoning the fight if it came to that. Alistair turned back to his commanders and began issuing orders in rapid succession, his hands moving in sign language while he spoke aloud so that everyone could follow. The situation was dire, Lyra quickly realized. Marcus had somehow assembled a force of nearly 200 wolves, drawing support from conservative noble families and packs who opposed the king's reforms. They had planned their attack carefully, timing it for the full moon when the pack's shifting abilities would be at their strongest, and they had brought siege weapons that were currently battering the keep's defenses. The rebel strategy was clear: break through to the throne room, capture or kill the king and princess, and install Marcus as the new ruler with a mandate to restore the traditional hierarchy. Already they had taken the outer courtyard and were advancing on the keep's main entrance, overwhelming the defenders through sheer numbers. "We need to fall back to the inner sanctum," one of the commanders was saying when Lyra tuned back into the conversation. "Concentrate our forces at the choke points where their numbers will not be an advantage. We can hold them off for days if necessary. Give time for reinforcements from allied packs to arrive." "No," another commander argued. "If we retreat, we give them control of most of the keep. They will take hostages from among the servants and civilians, use them to force our surrender. We need to push forward, drive them back before they can consolidate their position." The debate raged back and forth while precious seconds ticked away, and Lyra felt frustration building in her chest. These were experienced military minds, she knew, far more qualified than she to make strategic decisions. But they were thinking like soldiers defending a fortress, not like leaders trying to win hearts and minds. She stepped forward and slammed her hand on the war table hard enough to make everyone jump, then began signing with fierce intensity. "You are approaching this wrong," she signed, watching her father translate for those who did not understand. "This is not just a military battle. It is an ideological one. Marcus's army is not united by loyalty to him personally, but by fear of the changes we represent. Many of them are scared wolves who have been told that Omega equality means the destruction of everything they know. If we can break that fear, show them that we offer strength rather than weakness, we can turn some of them to our side." The commanders looked skeptical, but her father was nodding slowly. "What do you propose?" He signed. Lyra took a deep breath, knowing what she was about to suggest would terrify everyone in the room, including herself. "Let me speak to them," she signed. "Bring me to the front lines under heavy guard and let me address the rebel forces. I am the symbol they have been taught to fear, the deaf princess who supposedly corrupted their king. If I can show them that I am not weak, that the future we offer is not something to be afraid of, some of them might lay down their weapons." "Absolutely not," Alistair signed, his face flushing with anger. "You would be an easy target for archers or assassins. I will not risk your life on a gamble that appeals to wolves who are actively trying to kill us." "It is not a gamble," Lyra signed back. "It is the only way to end this without massive bloodshed on both sides. And I am already a target, Father. Marcus will not stop until I am dead, regardless of where I hide. At least this way I can use his obsession against him, draw him out and force him to face me directly." Before her father could respond, Evan stepped forward and signed, "I will go with her. As an Omega, I represent everything Marcus claims to despise. If the princess and I stand together in front of the rebels, it will force them to confront the reality of what they are fighting for, rather than the propaganda they have been fed." "You are both insane," Alistair signed, but Lyra could see him wavering. The logic of her argument was sound, even if the risk was enormous, and they all knew that a prolonged siege would result in casualties among the civilians trapped in the keep. Finally, he turned to his commanders. "What are your thoughts?" he asked aloud. The senior commander, a grizzled alpha named Garrett who had served 3 kings, stroked his beard thoughtfully. "It is risky," he admitted. "But the princess is right that this is as much about ideology as military force. And if she can sway even a quarter of Marcus's forces to stand down, it will shift the balance significantly in our favor. I say we try it, but with every precaution we can manage." The other commanders nodded their agreement, though some looked deeply uncomfortable with the plan. Alistair closed his eyes for a long moment, clearly warring with himself, then opened them and fixed Lyra with a look of such fierce love that it made her breath catch. "If you do this," he signed, "you will have 50 of my best warriors surrounding you at all times. You will wear armor enchanted to resist both weapons and magic. And at the first sign that the situation is turning against us, you will retreat immediately. Those are my conditions, and they are non-negotiable." "Agreed," Lyra signed, relief flooding through her that he had not forbidden the attempt entirely. The next 20 minutes were a flurry of preparation. Lyra was fitted with lightweight armor that had been blessed by the pack's shamans, spelled to turn aside blades and arrows while still allowing freedom of movement. Evan received similar protection, though his armor bore the Omega symbol prominently displayed across the chest, a deliberate choice to emphasize what they represented. 50 elite warriors assembled in formation around them, creating a protective box that would move with them toward the front lines. As they prepared to leave the throne room, Lyra's father caught her hand and pulled her into an embrace that spoke of all the years of distance between them and his desperate fear of losing her, now that they had finally reconnected. "Be safe," he signed against her shoulder where no one else could see. "I cannot lose you the way I lost your mother. You will not lose me," Lyra signed back, hoping it was a promise she could keep. "I am stronger than you think, stronger than even I knew." They moved through the keep to the main entrance where the fighting was fiercest, the sounds and smells of battle growing more intense with every step. Lyra's guards maintained their protective formation as they emerged into the courtyard, where Loyalist forces were barely holding a defensive line against the rebel advance. The sight that greeted them was carnage beyond anything Lyra had imagined. Wolves tearing at each other with savage desperation, while the cobblestones ran red with blood. But as Lyra stepped forward, still surrounded by her guards but clearly visible, something remarkable happened. The fighting began to slow, wolves on both sides pausing to stare at the princess who had walked into the middle of a battle as if she had every right to be there. Word spread quickly through the rebel ranks, and within minutes Marcus himself appeared at the front of his forces, his face twisted with rage and triumph in equal measure. "So the little princess finally shows herself," he shouted, his words translated by one of Lyra's guards who could read lips as well as she could. "Have you come to surrender? To beg for mercy before I tear down everything you have corrupted? Or are you simply too stupid to understand the danger you are in?" Lyra stepped forward despite her guards' protests, moving to the very edge of their protective circle so that her voice would carry to as many wolves as possible. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and then spoke aloud for the second time in her life, her words rough but clear enough to be understood. "I have come to offer you all a choice," she said, signing simultaneously so that her meaning could not be mistaken. "You have been told that the changes King Alistair has implemented will destroy the pack, that allowing Omegas to have rights and positions of authority will make us weak and vulnerable to our enemies. You have been told that I am broken, defective, unfit to have any role in leadership because I cannot hear. Marcus has fed you these lies because he knows that if you see the truth, you will abandon his cause and recognize him for the traitor and murderer that he is. The truth," Marcus snarled, "is that you are an abomination who has bewitched the king and perverted the natural order. You stand there with an Omega by your side as if he is your equal, as if rank means nothing, and you expect us to believe that this will make the pack stronger?" "Yes," Lyra signed and spoke, "because it will. Strength does not come from oppressing those you consider beneath you. It comes from allowing every member of the pack to contribute their unique gifts and perspectives. I am deaf, and that has taught me to see patterns that others miss, to observe body language and micro-expressions that reveal truth when words are lies. Evan is an Omega, and that has given him empathy and understanding that no amount of alpha dominance can replicate. Together, we are stronger than either of us could be alone, and the same is true of this pack, if you would only let go of your fear and prejudice." "Pretty words," Marcus sneered, "but words mean nothing in the face of reality. You want proof of strength? Then fight me. Single combat, right here, right now. If you win, I will order my forces to stand down and accept whatever punishment the king decrees. If I win, the reforms are abolished and the traditional hierarchy is restored. Unless, of course, you are too weak to accept the challenge." It was a trap, Lyra knew. Marcus was a trained warrior, and she had never fought anyone in her life beyond practice sessions with her guards. He would destroy her in seconds, and then he would use her death to demoralize the loyalist forces and claim that the goddess had judged in his favor. But before she could respond, Evan stepped forward and signed rapidly. "The challenge is invalid," he signed. "You are challenging her to single combat, but you have an army at your back ready to strike if things go poorly for you. If you truly believe in the strength of the old ways, then dismiss your forces and face her with nothing but your own skills. Prove that you do not need others to fight your battles for you." Marcus's face purpled with rage at being called out by an Omega, but Lyra saw several of the rebels shifting uncomfortably at Evan's words. They had come here believing they fought for honor and tradition, not to be used as pawns by a coward who hid behind his army. "Fine," Marcus spat. "I will send my forces back beyond the gates, and when I kill the princess with my bare hands, all of you will see that the goddess favors the strong over the weak, the alpha over the Omega, the natural order over this perversion." He turned and shouted orders to his army, and slowly, reluctantly, the rebel forces began to withdraw toward the outer walls. Lyra's guards protested vehemently at the idea of her fighting Marcus alone, but she signed to her father to allow it, knowing that this was the only way to truly end the conflict without massive bloodshed. "Trust me," she signed to Alistair through a messenger. "I have a plan." Her father signed back his reluctant agreement, and the guards withdrew to form a circle around the courtyard, creating an arena for the combat. Lyra stood in the center of that circle and watched Marcus approach with murder in his eyes, and she felt Selene stirring in her mind, ready to shift and fight. But Lyra had no intention of fighting Marcus in either human or wolf form, because she knew she could not win that way. Instead, she was going to fight him the way she had been fighting her whole life, by using her differences as strengths rather than weaknesses. As Marcus charged toward her with inhuman speed, Lyra closed her eyes. The gesture seemed suicidal, but Lyra had spent 19 years learning to navigate a world without sound, and in that time, she had developed senses that hearing wolves never bothered to cultivate. She could feel the vibration of Marcus's footsteps through the ground, could sense the displacement of air as his body moved, could read the subtle shifts in temperature and pressure that his approach created. She waited until the last possible second, until she could feel his breath on her face though she could not hear his snarl, and then she dropped and rolled to the side. Marcus's momentum carried him past her and he stumbled, shocked that his target had evaded him without even looking. The watching wolves gasped, and Lyra opened her eyes to see confusion on Marcus's face. He had expected an easy victory, a quick kill that would prove his superiority. Instead, he had been made to look clumsy and slow by a deaf woman who had dodged his attack without using her eyes. He came at her again, and again Lyra avoided him, this time using her knowledge of body language to predict which way he would strike. She had watched hundreds of training sessions over the years, had studied the way wolves moved in combat, and she recognized the telltale shift in Marcus's shoulders that indicated a right-handed punch. She swayed left and his fist whistled through empty air where her head had been moments before. "Stand still and fight me," Marcus roared, but Lyra just smiled and signed. "Why? So you can use your superior size and strength against me? I thought you wanted to prove that might makes right. So far, all you have proven is that you cannot catch a deaf woman half your size." The insult stung, and Marcus began to lose his composure, attacking wildly rather than with the disciplined technique of a trained warrior. Lyra danced away from each strike, conserving her energy while he exhausted himself, and she saw some of the rebel wolves beginning to look uncertain. This was not the demonstration of alpha superiority they had been promised. Finally, Marcus made a critical mistake, overextending on a wild haymaker that left him off balance. Lyra seized the opportunity, shifting partially to call on Selene's strength and speed, and delivered a precise strike to the pressure point behind his knee that her mother had taught her years ago. Marcus went down hard, crashing to the cobblestones with a grunt of pain, and Lyra was on him in an instant, her partially shifted claws at his throat. "Yield," she signed with one hand while holding him immobile with the other. "You have lost, and everyone here has witnessed it. The deaf princess you claimed was weak has defeated you without killing you, showing more mercy than you ever showed anyone. Yield and I will spare your life. Refuse, and I will end you here and now." Marcus's eyes blazed with hatred, but he could feel her claws pricking his skin, and he knew she was not bluffing. He had a choice: die proud or live humiliated, and survival instinct won out over ego. "I yield," he gasped, and the words seemed to physically pain him. Lyra stood and stepped back, releasing him but keeping her guard up in case he tried something desperate. She turned to address the rebel forces who were staring in shock at their defeated leader. "Your beta told you that the old ways were stronger," she signed and spoke. "But I have just proven otherwise using skills that I developed because I am deaf, not in spite of it. He told you that Omegas like Evan were worthless, but it was Evan's quick thinking that forced this confrontation and exposed Marcus's cowardice. Everything you were told about weakness and strength was a lie designed to keep you subservient to those who benefited from your oppression." She paused, letting her words sink in, then continued. "King Alistair is offering amnesty to any rebel who lays down their weapons and swears loyalty to the new order. You will not be punished for following Marcus's lies, not if you choose differently now that you know the truth, but if you continue to fight for a system that values birth over character and rank over merit. You will be treated as traitors and dealt with accordingly. The choice is yours." For a long moment, no one moved, the tension in the courtyard thick enough to choke on. Then one of the rebels, a young alpha woman, stepped forward and laid her sword on the ground. "I was told we were fighting to protect tradition," she said. But if tradition means following a murderer and a thief, then I want no part of it. I swear loyalty to King Alistair and to the New Order." Her defection broke the dam. One by one, the rebels began laying down their weapons, some reluctantly and others with visible relief. Within minutes, nearly 3/4 of Marcus's army had surrendered, leaving only the most hardcore conservatives standing in defiant isolation. Those who had not surrendered were quickly surrounded and disarmed by loyalist forces, and Marcus himself was dragged away in silver chains to await trial for his crimes. Lyra watched him go and felt no satisfaction, only exhaustion and a bone-deep weariness at the cost of what they had accomplished. Evan appeared at her side, his face streaked with dirt and his eyes shining with emotion. "You were magnificent," he signed. "Terrifying and brilliant and absolutely magnificent." Lyra leaned against him, her legs suddenly weak now that the adrenaline was fading. "I was terrified," she signed back. "I thought he was going to kill me, but he did not," Evan signed. "And now everyone has seen that the future you represent is not just possible, but inevitable. You changed minds today, Lyra. You gave wolves hope that they could be valued for who they are, rather than what they were born as." Her father approached then, and Lyra saw that he had tears streaming down his face. He pulled her into a crushing embrace, signing frantically against her back where she could feel the shapes of the words even if she could not see them. "Never do that to me again," he signed. "My heart cannot take watching you face down a murderer in single combat. Promise me you will never be that reckless again." Lyra pulled back and smiled at him. "I promise to try," she signed. "But I cannot promise to always choose safety over what is right. I learned that from you, and from Mother. Leaders sometimes have to take risks to protect those they serve." Alistair laughed wetly and shook his head. "You are so much like Alara," he signed. "Brave and stubborn and absolutely impossible to argue with. She would have been so proud of you today." The aftermath of the rebellion took weeks to sort through. Marcus was tried before a council of elders from multiple packs and found guilty of murder, treason, embezzlement, and conspiracy. He was executed at the next full moon, and though some conservative factions grumbled about the speed of the trial, none dared to openly protest after witnessing Lyra's victory in the courtyard. The rebels who had surrendered were offered a choice: accept the new order and work to help implement the reforms, or be exiled from the kingdom with their families. Most chose to stay, and many of them became some of the most vocal advocates for Omega rights, after seeing firsthand how their prejudices had been manipulated. The noble families who had withdrawn their support from the crown found themselves isolated and politically irrelevant as younger members defected to join the reformist movement. The two packs that had threatened to secede eventually returned to the fold after their leaders were overthrown by Omega wolves within their own ranks who demanded equal treatment. Lyra threw herself into the work of rebuilding and reform with renewed purpose. She worked with scholars to create the sign language curriculum for schools, personally training the first generation of teachers who would bring the language to every corner of the kingdom. She established legal protections for Omega wolves and created a system of impartial courts where grievances could be heard without fear of retaliation from nobles. And she worked alongside Evan, who had been appointed as the royal archivist, with a mandate to preserve the stories of Omega wolves and other marginalized members of the pack. Together, they collected oral histories, documented the old ways that had been destroyed by the hierarchy, and created a new narrative of pack history that included all voices, rather than just those of the powerful. 6 months after the rebellion, on the winter solstice when the longest night gave way to returning light, Lyra and Evan stood before the assembled pack and formalized their bond. It was not a traditional mating ceremony because there was nothing traditional about their relationship, but rather a celebration of partnership and equality that reflected the values they had fought so hard to establish. King Alistair performed the ceremony himself, his signs graceful and precise as he spoke the words that bound his daughter to the Omega who had helped save the kingdom. When it was done, when the rings had been exchanged and the vows spoken, he embraced them both and whispered something that only Lyra could read on his lips. "Your mother would have loved him," he said, "and she would have been so proud of the leader you have become." Lyra smiled through her tears and signed back. I know. I feel her with me every day, guiding me, reminding me that love is stronger than fear, and that change, though painful, is always possible. The celebration that followed was unlike anything the pack had seen before. A joyous chaos of wolves from all ranks dancing and singing together, without the rigid separations that had defined every gathering in the past. Omega wolves sat at tables with alphas. Children played without being separated by their birth status. And for the first time in generations, the pack felt like a unified whole rather than a collection of hostile factions. As the night wore on and the festivities continued, Lyra found herself standing on a balcony overlooking the courtyard with Evan at her side. The winter air was cold against her skin, but the warmth of his presence more than compensated, and she leaned into him with a contentment she had never thought possible. "What are you thinking?" he signed, his fingers gentle as they shaped the question. Lyra considered for a moment, watching the wolves below celebrate the solstice and the new order they had created together. "I am thinking that we did it," she signed finally. "We took a kingdom built on oppression and fear and transformed it into something better. It is not perfect, and there is still so much work to be done, but it is a start, a real start." "And what comes next?" Evan asked. "What dreams are you dreaming now that this one has come true?" Lyra smiled, fierce and hopeful. "Now we make sure this change spreads beyond Thornwall," she signed. "We reach out to other packs, other kingdoms, and we show them that there is another way. We build alliances with those who share our values, and we pressure those who do not until they have no choice but to evolve. And we train the next generation to carry this work forward so that no wolf ever again has to suffer the way we did, simply because they were born different." Evan laughed and pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Of course," he signed, "because you are not content with changing one kingdom. You want to change the world. Why settle for less?" Lyra signed back, and there was no humor in it, only iron determination. "I spent 19 years being told I was worthless, that my silence made me weak and my deafness made me unfit to lead. I proved them all wrong, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure that no other wolf has to fight so hard just to be seen as a person. And I will be right beside you," Evan signed, his eyes shining with love and pride. "Every step of the way, for as long as you will have me. Always," Lyra signed. "For always and forever." They stood together in the cold winter night, watching their pack celebrate below and dreaming of the future they would build together. Lyra thought about her mother, about the journals they had filled with hopes and fears and love, and she made a silent promise to Alara's memory. She would honor the sacrifice by living fully and fearlessly, by using her voice, both spoken and signed, to advocate for those who could not advocate for themselves, by being the leader her mother had always believed she could be. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be setbacks and struggles, wolves who resisted change and tried to turn back the clock to a simpler time when hierarchy was unquestioned. But Lyra had faced death itself and emerged victorious, had stared down a murderer and defeated him through skill and cunning rather than brute force. She was the deaf princess who had found her voice, the Omega's mate who had changed a kingdom, the daughter who had avenged her mother and reclaimed her father's love. She was Lyra Ravenshade, and her story was far from over. Inside the keep, King Alistair watched his daughter and her mate standing together on the balcony, and he felt his heart swell with pride and grief in equal measure. Alara should have been here to see this, he thought, to see the remarkable woman their daughter had become. But perhaps she was watching somehow, her spirit carried on the winter wind, rejoicing in the changes that had transformed Thornwall from a prison of prejudice into a beacon of hope. He had spent so many years lost in grief and manipulation, allowing Marcus to poison his mind against the one person who might have saved him from his own worst impulses. But Lyra had forgiven him, had given him a second chance to be the father he should have been from the beginning, and he was determined not to waste it. Tomorrow he would announce his plans to establish a council of advisors drawn from all ranks, with Lyra as his heir apparent and Evan as the first Omega to hold a position of royal authority. There would be objections from conservative factions, But after witnessing Lyra's victory over Marcus, their protests would carry little weight. The kingdom was changing, evolving into something better than it had been, and Alistair was grateful that he had lived long enough to see it. His legacy would not be the wars he had won or the territories he had conquered, but the daughter he had raised who had torn down the walls he had built and created something beautiful from the ruins. As the solstice celebration continued into the early hours of the morning, as wolves danced and sang and celebrated the return of the light, Lyra and Evan slipped away to their chambers hand in hand. They had fought so hard to reach this moment, had survived betrayal and violence and the weight of expectations that had threatened to crush them. But they had not just survived. They had thrived, had taken their pain and transformed it into purpose, had used their differences as strengths rather than accepting them as weaknesses. And now, finally, they could rest in the knowledge that they had earned their peace, had paid the price for change in blood and tears and unwavering determination. Lyra curled up in Evan's arms as the first light of dawn filtered through their window, and she felt Celine settling contentedly in her mind, her wolf finally at peace after so many years of restless anxiety. They had done it, she thought drowsily. They had actually done it, and this was only the beginning.